Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And welcome, David. It's a privilege to be here this evening to speak with David Cote, former CEO of Honeywell International, and now actually Executive Chairman of Vertiv Holdings. Among his many things that he has done, David was also a recipient of one of our prestigious awards from Columbia Business School, the Deming Cup Award for Operational Excellence. And in just a few short weeks, he will add in his bucket list of accomplishments to be an author of a book that is coming up, Winning Now, Winning Later. Tonight we'll plan to talk a little bit about his professional journey and the crisis that he actually handled, managed through, and then also talk about a lot of the lessons learned throughout that time, and talk a little bit about the book, and then inadvertently talk a little bit about everything that is going on today in the world and in this country, and the challenges that we're facing in these turbulent times. Now, before I get started, I want to say that people can submit questions in the Q&A box, and then later on we'll switch to handling these questions from all of you. And we'll have 5 signed copies from David's book, and people that submit questions will get their autographed copy later on through the centers.
Big incentive.
Yeah, bet. Absolutely. I'm not getting a signed copy. But now, I want to, again, express a warm welcome from our co-sponsors of the event, the Bernstein Center for Leadership and Ethics and the Deming Center for Quality, Productivity, and Competitiveness, and the Leadership Lab. So let's dive in. Thank you very much, David, for joining us. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm very glad to be here, and especially as a recipient of the Deming Prize. So thank you.
This is fantastic. So I want to start by going back to the time when you joined as CEO of Honeywell. That was 2002. And want to tell us a little bit about the state of the company at that point in time, because that defines the journey that came after that.
Yeah, let's say there were 2 different pictures, externally and internally, in terms of perspective. And as bad as the external perspective looked, the internal one was even worse. So externally, what investors could see were 4 years of huge amount of write-offs, $8 billion or so. Integration of Honeywell and Allied Signal, acquisition of Pitway hadn't worked all that well, missed a lot of numbers. Company was sold to UTX, quickly followed by sale to GE. Year and a half later, the GE decides to walk away from the sale because the EU conditions are too strong. The CEO leaves. A temporary CEO is brought back in. Externally, everybody could see, oh, this is not good. And I knew that coming in, that it did not look good. I arrived in mid-February of 2002 as the CEO, and was told that for the first 4.5 months, I was not allowed to see the books. That the chairman would run the company to make the numbers, and it was my job to just learn the businesses. And I can remember asking finance guys a couple of times during that 4.5 months, the typical, how's the quarter going? And they would tell me, I'm sorry, Dave, but I've been instructed not to answer any of those questions from you. And it's, okay, well, that's a little different, so much for being the CEO, but okay, I'll bide my time, and in 4.5 months, things will work out. Well, 4.5 months later, when I became the chairman and now became responsible for the numbers, in that next couple of months, I realized the difficulty that we were facing. First of all, we had very aggressive, unhealthy accounting and business practices. Distributor loading, getting deals done with suppliers at the end of the quarter or partners, a lot of accounting entries, and you can see it, just 10 years of free cash flow conversion was 69%, meaning for every dollar of income, only 69 cents of cash was being generated. So it gives you a sense of what was going on. We had a significantly underfunded pension plan in the billions, environmental issues that a 100-year-old chemical company will have that had never been addressed. And the strategy at the time was to fight in court until you lose and then pay. And asbestos liabilities that had not been recognized or dealt with. In addition, I had a board and a staff that I couldn't trust, because on my staff alone, 3 people had interviewed or expressed interest in my job. And I don't think any of the 3 of them looked at it and said, oh yeah, that was the right guy. They picked him, and not picking me was a good idea. Picking him was smart. I don't think any of them felt that way. So it was an interesting start.
Wow.
Yeah.
Especially the first 4.5 months sound extremely opaque.
Well, that opaqueness was actually easier to deal with, because if you don't know there's a problem, you don't worry about it, because you don't know. Once it became apparent, then my life became really interesting.
Yeah. So what was the, Honeywell, of course, over your leadership period, had a tremendous run.
Things worked out okay. Yes, thank you.
And clearly, the picture that you just described was not one of rosy expectations. So presumably, you had to, in some sense, focus how to course correct and then align the business with what you thought was the right vision, and then execute on that over a long period of time. What were the key ways that you applied in that journey? I mean, because you went from a problematic start to an enormously successful outcome over the next decade and a half.
Yeah, I have to say, I did had to do a bit of soul searching myself in the beginning, because like I said, it's not like I could talk to anybody on the board or the staff about it. And I was also burdened when it came to investors, because as they said on CNBC at one point, we're not sure this company can be turned around, and if it can, we're not sure this is the guy to do it, because he didn't make it to the first tier in the GE succession race. He wasn't the first choice to run Honeywell, which was also true. And I missed my numbers right off the bat in the first 3 weeks that I was now the chairman. So it took a fair amount of soul searching to say, okay, nobody really seems to believe in me here other than myself. So what do I think I need to do? And I kind of just took it back to basics and said, okay, you got to start with a good foundation on anything. And if we don't fix our books and we don't fix our business practices, if we don't address all these legacy issues that we've got, if we don't start to do some of the seed planting that's going to allow us to have a good future, none of this is going to work. So all I'm going to do is, if I'm just kind of running the treadmill here and just doing the same thing everybody always did because I don't want to miss a quarter, I'm never going to get better. So I came to that kind of fundamental realization and said, okay, I'm going to do that. And then took the next step to say, and I don't want to be in the same position 3 years from now. So how do I start to do some of the seed planting that I need to so that I'll perform in the long term? I can't say that investors thought it was a great idea when I first started talking to them about what I was doing. And they'd want to know, why aren't margin rates going up even faster, even though we were doing better than our peers? Because, as you know, the premise of the book is to do well in the short term and the long term. And we were doing the right things to generate better returns than our peers. But given our sales growth, they thought our margin rates should have been higher. And I used to have to try to explain, well, yes, they could be higher, but I'm reinvesting a lot. And I'm doing the seed planting that's going to be important so that we do well 3 years from now, 5 years from now. A lot of them didn't get it. I'd say there was one investor that I thought was particularly good here, and that was Fidelity. They were with me from the very beginning. And when other investors or sell side analysts would complain about every quarter has restructuring. When does it stop? And I'd say stuff like, well, if I do my job right, it's never going to stop. You got to keep evolving. You got to keep changing. And man, they did not want to hear that. The Fidelity guys were good. They became our biggest share owner. And I remember them telling me, no, stick with it. And that was very valuable to me at the time.
So this tension between short-term focus and long-term objectives seems to have played crucially during that time.
Yes, it did.
And it's a huge issue that we're facing in every corporation constantly, right? The pressure to report quarterly results for publicly listed companies, it's enormous, the way our markets actually function. And it creates really disincentive to focus on important long-term initiatives. How did you navigate that? How did the board warmed up to that, for example?
Well, the way I navigated it was to perform in both the short term and the long term. So that versus all of my, say, investor competitors or investor peers, I could show that our income, cash flow, and as a result, stock price was outperforming the average for our peers because we were doing the right things in the short term. And this is kind of a fundamental concept that we've run Honeywell by and that we work with Vertiv in. And I always say success in business is about achieving two seemingly conflicting things at the same time. Do you want low inventory or do you want great customer delivery? Do you want high prices and margin rates or do you want big volumes? Do you want empowerment so the people closest to the action can make quick decisions? Or do you want good control so nothing bad happens? In every case, you want both. The trick is to figure out, how do I accomplish both? The same is true with short-term, long-term. And investors, bosses, others are not going to accept, hey, it's going to be great 5 years from now, just stick with me. If you're an investor, you say, great, see you in 5 years. I'm not going to stick with you that long, and justifiably so. That's what they get measured on. So I felt like I had to figure out a way to accomplish both, which we did. And one of the big ways that I ran Honeywell was to say, we're going to grow sales and hold fixed costs constant. And if you look at most businesses, variable rates of margin, contribution margin, whatever you want to call it, is in the, we'll say 30 to 60% range, depending on the business you're in. If you can hold your fixed costs constant, it's amazing what that fall through does in order to cause you to have the money to generate the return you need for your owners, but also to reinvest. And that became a big deal for us, and we're applying the same technique at Vertiv. So I was a big believer in you have to do both. You have to figure out how to do both. And we did. And if you take a look at our stock price performance, for example, you'll see in the first 5 or 6 years, we exceed the S&P 500 by a bit. In the last 10 years, we just blow it out of the water because all that pipeline work we did paid off.
So I guess in your book, you focus a little bit about, how to invest, pursue the long term, and that this does not really have to be at the expense of short-term gains.
Correct.
Right. And
yep, that's exactly right. Because too many people want to make it sound like it's mutually exclusive. You're either short-term or long-term. I also know there is no way we're going to regulate our way to long-termism. And I do think that people who complain too much about they're not allowed to invest, I mean, they're really, I think, whining a bit and not looking at, okay, what do I need to do in order to accomplish both and not use markets as an excuse.
So one thing, I skimmed through some of the things that you have said, and one thing that comes alive is how you align long-term objectives to more or less day-to-day operations, our job, our day-to-day job. You know, the I don't want to call it minutia, but you know, like there's a lot of steps that need to actually be executed in order for a manufacturing firm like yours to actually build product, deliver product, serve product to your customer base. And it seems like you always pivoted towards aligning how to do these day-to-day tasks.
Mm-hmm.
This sequence of 5,000 tasks that need to be done in order to actually go from raw materials to finished, tested, highly performing product to the client, to somehow to the long-term vision of the firm. And this is eventually how the firm moves in that direction. That
you are absolutely correct. And too often, if you take a look at any company, strategy tends to be an annual event. And the big presentations get done. People work for months on these things. It's a show that they have to put on. And then it kind of gets put to the side. And then you get back to making numbers and how you're going to make numbers. And the numbers that need to get made are whatever is the critical quarter. And I always kind of joked that the critical quarter was whatever one you were in. That's how it was viewed. So I always wanted to connect. What were we saying in that strategic plan about how great it was going to be in the future? And what specifically were we going to do in order to make that greatness happen? And it doesn't usually end up being a lot of things. It can get pretty involved, but there's usually some process work you got to do, some globalization, what new markets or acquisitions or products do you want to go into. So it's not a crazy amount of stuff. And what I like to do is then take those things, and to your point, instead of like annual milestones, we used to talk about having inch stones that said, okay, this is where you want to be next year with this product or this development or in China or wherever. What are you going to do next month? What are you going to do the month after that? Because if they're needing to go to China, for example, but they don't hire anybody there for the next 7 months because that strategic plan didn't require it, well, you're not going to get anywhere. Whereas if the next month they got to show, okay, I did something, you get there. And that's why I set aside 12 growth days a year, 12 full days with me and my staff. And they didn't have to all attend. It depended on the specific topics. And we would keep track of all these key strategic issues or investments that we were making to say, is it happening the way you said it was going to happen in the strategic plan? And if it's not, what do we need to do differently? If it's going great, what do we do to help you to accelerate it? Because you want to accelerate your good stuff just as much as you want to fix your stuff that's not working. I also, when it came to the strategic plan, this one, my business leaders used to find interesting, but in January of the current year, so we'll say it's January of 2021, I would call each of them and say, here's the numbers I expect you to hit in 2022. And when it comes to your strategic planning, this is how I want to see it reflected, because I want to understand how are you going to achieve those numbers, but also do all the seed planting investment that is required. And oftentimes they'd say something like, well, what are you talking about? We haven't finished 2021, never mind next year. And my comment was always, look, we already talked about 2021. As far as I'm concerned, you're going to make it. So I want to make sure we're doing all the right stuff this year to invest so that we make 2022 and that we invest for the future. And it just creates a very different headset with people if they have to start thinking that way instead of just trying to grind it out every single quarter.
Interesting.
It's different, but it works.
Yeah, no, I can see how it works. Also, I admire the commitment of carving out 12 days in a year.
Yeah.
Really, I mean, because it sounds simple, but,
Yes.
but carving out 12 days and committing to that, that's a big investment.
It is, but I felt like if I didn't do it, then to your point, making sure that the short-term inch stones were aligning with the milestones that we had created for that long-term just weren't going to happen, and they wouldn't, because it's too easy when you get in the middle of operations and the daily grind of things to remember, oh, I got to do this strategic thing too. It's easy to let it slip.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I want to switch a little bit from, we've been talking about the job of the CEO and how to lead a large, complex organization. But I want to switch a little bit, thinking about your book and thinking about how do the principles that you lay out in the book really apply to people that are earlier on in their careers, either our students that are about to graduate or our alums that are, let's say, mid-career. They're in this professional journey, either early or in the middle of that. And in some sense, how do the principles that relate to the leader of the firm connect to what people should be doing along the journey?
Yeah. I guess the first thing, and I say this about every leader on anything new that has to happen, is the first thing anyone has to do is change their own mindset. And they need to recognize that it's doable. The second thing that I would suggest is I think there's a tendency for people to say, man, I really could do this if only those guys would change how they're thinking about this. So until that happens, I'm good. I can just do what I'm told. Instead of looking at it and saying, okay, what can I control? What can I do with the things I do control to start to exhibit this mindset? And then start to do it that way. And I think they'll find that as they start to do that, they'll find things where they say, I need to talk to my boss or my boss's boss about something because we're missing a big process opportunity or customer opportunity. And if they would just give me a little bit of forbearance this year, I can promise them I'll give them this next year. And too often, what I used to find is people would come into the office with that kind of argument. And I'd say something like, okay, so if I give you the money, what are you going to give me back? Now, all of a sudden, they panic and go, well, wait a minute, we're just kind of taking a flyer here on something. Go, no. It may not work, I understand, but you need to commit here. You got to show some guts yourself. And if you think this is a great idea, what are you willing to commit to and put yourself on the line for to say you're going to do to get this? So I think you got to have some guts. The third thing I'd suggest is as part of developing that mindset, it's a good thing to just kind of look at what everybody else is doing, what you read about other companies have done. Do you think they're being short-sighted, long-sighted, missing something? When you look at other people in the company, who do you think does a particularly good job of that? Watch them, see the kind of decisions they make. I mean, I learned a lot just by watching others and seeing what worked and what didn't.
Okay, that's great. I have a few more questions, but I wanted to take a little bit of time before we switch to questions that people are asking.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about sort of managing in a crisis period. And I want to go back, before we talk about what's happening right now, I want to go back to your navigation of Honeywell during the 08, 09, 2010 crisis. I think you talk a lot about, in your book, about how you managed the firm during that period. In particular, you didn't lay off anyone during that period.
But we did lay off some,
Yeah.
but it was always, if it was going to be a permanent job loss, we would not be hiring back.
Yes.
But not many relative to the scheme of things, correct.
And so what was the priority? What was the thinking back then? And how are you thinking right now in your current role at Vertiv?
Yeah. Well, of course, as you might imagine, we're applying all the same lessons that we learned at Honeywell to what we do at Vertiv. The added complexity this time is the health issue, which we did not have to deal with in 08, 09. So that's a complication to it. But a lot of the same principles apply. The first one is, as a leader, don't panic. And man, it is when things start to get tough, and the newspapers, the media, all the people around you are panicking, government's panicking, man, it's really easy to lose your head in that. And I was always struck by the poem If by Rudyard Kipling. He had this line in there: if you can keep your head while everybody around you is losing theirs, then you'll be a man, my son. I gave it to both my own sons to say, remember this, because it happens all the time. So number one, don't panic. Number two, the importance of independent thinking. And one of the things that surprised me during the course of my career is that the ability to think independently is a lot more rare than being smart. And there's a lot of smart people who can just explain how the herd is thinking in all kinds of statistics and detail. But that ability to actually think for yourself and say, okay, what's going to be smart here? How do I think about this? Matters greatly. And don't expect you're going to get consensus from your staff, because a number of them are going to be panicking. So if there's ever a time to really make good decisions and think independently, that's it. A third one would be remember your customers. And it's too easy to forget your customers, either when it comes to basic things like delivering quality, or the commitments you made to them on new products or services or countries you were going to enter. Don't cut any of that, because that's going to be the source of all the earnings and cash flow you use for investors and employees. So remember customers. When it came to the specifics of what we dealt with, the fourth one I would say is don't believe all the people who feel the recession lasts forever. And that was true last time, and it's true this time. And last time we were going through, this is an L-shaped recovery. It's a U-shaped recovery. A lot of the same discussions that we're having now, but rather believe in the power of the economy to be able to grow again, and be thinking about recovery even when you're in the middle of the recession, so that you do the right things when it comes to material, labor, and your customers. We did things differently as a result of all that. And yes, you're correct. Nobody was using furloughs at the time. Another school, business school, wrote a case study about furloughs and what we did. And because there was so little known about it, we actually, as a big company, had to go and research this, because all the states were different, countries around the world were different. So it took a lot of work to understand how to do it everywhere. But I always felt like the way we laid off people in a recession didn't make sense, because you have to notify them. There's WARN Act, there's severance. So we'll say it costs you 6 months. Then you get 6 months of return, so that you basically get back to even. So the money you sent out is you've now got back. Then you get 6 months of return at best, because then the recovery starts. Now you're scrambling, trying to find the right people and the right employees to come back. And I thought, if anybody ever said for a factory, tell you what, take 6 months to build it, we'll get our money back in 6 months, then we'll get a return for 6 months, then we'll shut it down. No finance guy would sign off on that. They'd all say, well, that's ridiculous. We're not going to do that. But we do it with people all the time.
Yeah.
And I thought it was an important thing to do to maintain our industrial base, was to be able to recover those people and get them back into work really quickly. And yes, it was going to be a little tougher for everyone, because they were all going to be working with it for a little less money than they had before. But we also wouldn't be crushing anybody either when it came to, okay, now you don't have a job at all, and all the uncertainty, and who knows where that's going to lead. We also let us to do things with benefits rather than cutting salaries that we mostly restored afterwards. And it just created a different dynamic for us in terms of how we thought about things. And I've been very encouraged to see in this recession how extensively furloughs have been used as opposed to layoffs.
Yes. Yeah. 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 That's true. Let me switch. You mentioned the manufacturing. You mentioned the people that work in your plants. I'm putting my Deming cup on. What do you think about the importance of manufacturing in the U.S. economy? We talk about this being a services-oriented economy in large scale. I myself participate in that by either advising financial firms or technology firms, but in some sense, manufacturing continues to be the backbone in some ways. So, what are your thoughts about that? You run one of the largest conglomerates that build stuff.
Yeah. You're always going to need physical stuff. You always are. And the U.S. economy is going to have to continue to make a lot of that physical stuff. And there's a lot of people who say software is going to be everything. And I'm a big believer in software and the interaction with physical goods. As you probably saw at Honeywell, half our engineers were developing software. So it is a big deal. That being said, if you want to fly somewhere, you have to get on a plane that somebody built with an engine that somebody built. If you want to drive somewhere, you got to get in a vehicle. You want to live in a house, you're not going to live in an AI environment. There's always going to be a need for physical stuff. And manufacturing's share of US GDP has declined as a percent over time. The fact is, manufacturing has actually grown over time. So it's something like 2.5 times bigger than it was 20 years ago overall, even though it's less as a percent of the total. So it's still growing, and we're still going to need it. It's going to be an essential part of how do we have a properly functioning economy. It's not going to disappear. As you can tell, I like manufacturing too. So I grew up as an hourly employee, so I started early.
Yeah. It's also something that may rebound faster in post-COVID-19. So that's interesting. I want to hit 2 more points before we switch to others. One is climate. And I'm saying that because it relates a little bit to the short-term, long-term conversation that we were having earlier on. So climate change is one of these things that will have to affect how companies behave, how they participate in the economy, decisions that they make. And, that's going to be something sustained over the long term, but, it will have short-term implications. What are your thoughts about that? Did you do any of that thinking back at Honeywell you said you inherited a company that had a 100-year history of chemical production that doesn't sound particularly good. So you must have grappled with that problem.
Okay, there's a lot to talk about here. So I'd say, first of all, my conclusion is going to be every company needs to do what they can. However, I would say the focus on U.S. companies is not going to address the issue. And there needs to be a recognition that the U.S. contributes about 50. And unless something is done to get some kind of agreement for the other 85% to do something collectively, our working on our 15% is not going to make much of a difference. It's not. So if we continue the way we are, it's going to be more a case of how do we deal with the effects of the issue as opposed to addressing the issue. That being said, in my role, in my view, business's primary responsibility is still to become a better and better company in terms of financial performance over time. And the reason for that is that's where standard of living comes from. We all live well in the US because of the productivity driven by US companies. So standard of living comes from productivity, productivity comes from companies. And we don't ever want to lose that connection. So I dislike when I hear people talking too much about social responsibility for companies because or stakeholders, because it sounds too much like, okay, here's an excuse to no longer perform and to no longer worry about being the best or being the most productive. I can focus on something else. All that being said, you have a license to operate from the public as a company. You need to be responsible at the same time you're performing. And I think it's a mistake for any company to ignore that. So for us, climate change, for example, we were able to reduce our energy efficiency by 70% and our greenhouse gas emissions by even more because we found some where there was greater intensity. We reduced our water usage, our health safety incidents. We ended up being 80% above the industry average in terms of our overall capability. Our environmental incidents declined by 93%. We had a 100-year-old chemical company, to your point, with a strategy to just fight it in court until you lose. Well, I took a different approach and said, this is not who I want to be. This is not who I want Honeywell to be, especially given all the energy efficiency and non-ozone depleting products we had. We were on the side of the angels, and I thought it doesn't make sense to have an environmental strategy like that. And besides, that's not who I want to be, and I don't think it's what I want our employees to be. So we spent 15 years and $3.5 billion resolving all the issues. And one of the biggest ones, of course, was Onondaga Lake, which was considered the most polluted lake in America, and now you can swim in it in upstate New York. Great story. We did the same thing with the pension plan, and I felt like, okay, I had an underfunded pension plan. I didn't want to be a CEO, and I didn't want to be the kind of company where the money ran out for retirees from commitments that we'd made to them. We invested $5 billion in our pension plan, which investors did not like, I have to say. They did not think that was a great use of share owner money. But I felt like it was important to do. This was, kind of a socially responsible thing to do at the same time we were performing. So we were able to do all that. At the same time, we were increasing the market capitalization from 20 billion to 120 billion over 16 years, and an overall return of 800%, which beat the S&P 500 by 2.5 times. And it's why I keep coming back to it's possible to do short-term and long-term at the same time. Because all of those things people would have looked at and said, what, if you said, okay, I'm just focused on the share owner, why are you doing this? My argument was, this is the best thing for the share owner. You don't want to have a socially irresponsible company. You want to perform at the same time that you are being socially responsible and you're being responsible to your employees. So a more complicated and maybe a complex answer than you were looking for, but I do think it's important for companies to be able to do both. You still have to perform because the future of the company, future of the country depends upon companies performing.
Yeah, and I actually like the thesis insofar that when you're focusing on long-term objectives of the firm, that ultimately leads by itself to a leadership that is, in some sense, is more inclusive, is more socially responsible.
Yeah.
You cannot alienate your workforce. You cannot alienate your customers. You cannot alienate, right? Because you're not going to be shutting down the firm in a year or at the end of this quarter. So you're trying to just finish up with good numbers now and go home, right?
You are exactly right. Because too often, I think media and others take this discussion of the share owner to mean it excludes everything else. If you're a smart leader, and you're doing the right thing for the share owner, it means performing. You still got to perform. At the same time, you're doing the right things for employees and communities and other issues that you're dealing with. You don't just walk away from it.
Because it is the fabric on which you build a successful company.
Yep, and it's going to be essential to the long term. I did not want to pass on an environmentally unfriendly company to my successor. And I thought, this is wrong. That's not who I want to be. It's not who I want the company to be.
Okay. What do you think? I know I keep saying I'll switch to the questions of the audience, and I will. Last one by me. So currently there is a lot of talk about how businesses themselves need to step up and be part of the solution of race discrimination, equal opportunity. How do we address these issues, both as a society, clearly, and government, violence, things of that sort, but the reality is also in terms of economic opportunity. And based on your comments before, economic opportunity is created by those corporations. This is where people work.
Yep.
So do you have any thoughts about that? I'm sure people are calling you to hear your thoughts. You must be involved in these dialogues right now. Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah. First of all, I should caveat all this as I'm a 67-year-old white male CEO who grew up in New Hampshire. So my knowledge of the Black experience is just taken from books and from friends that I talk to who have had that experience. So up front, I'm going to say, I may unknowingly say something offensive to someone, but please just give me some forbearance on it and assume there's no malintent connected with it. And by the way, I would say of all the CEOs that I do know out there, I think most of them are in the same boat. We're all in a position right now where we're just trying to understand better what is it that we may unknowingly be doing, because I can't say I've ever met any CEO who ever said anything derogatory when it came to race. Not one on anything. So, and I certainly don't feel I'm that way. And we didn't run Honeywell that way. And our diversity statistics improved consistently because we worked on it. I met with my staff twice a year to just go through all the opportunities for both hiring and attrition to make sure that we steadily improved and we were doing the right things. So I felt like we were trying to do those things. But that being said, I clearly don't have the understanding that I need to have here. And I think that's true for most of us. And just a bunch of people yelling, do better, isn't always helpful. If there was something a little more specific about, okay, Dave, when you say something like this, you don't mean anything by it, but it strikes a hot button for us. That's the sort of thing that would be very helpful for all of us to understand. The other thing I would like to see more of that you touched on is we don't really have the discussion about the socioeconomic side of this. And minorities are clearly, people of color clearly overrepresented in that lower range of that social economic continuum. And for me, the fundamental there is education and parental involvement in that education. The thing we need to do on the education side is we don't fund it smartly. It's all local, driven local. We do need national test standards, even though I think a lot of people hate the idea. I don't see how it's a bad idea to say you got to have a certain fundamentals of knowledge. Parents need to ask if you did your homework. And unless we start to address the education side of this, I'm afraid we're not doing those things in the short term that are going to give us a much better solution in the long term. So I would like to see much more discussion about education and how are we going to make sure that we fund it differently and every kid gets a chance. And I point to my own story. I was the first kid in my family to graduate from high school. So my dad had 6 months of high school. My mom had 2 days and a year of a secretarial degree. But they focused greatly on get your homework done every night. You're going to go to college someday. They said it all the time. I remember my dad saying, "You're going to, I don't care if you dig ditches, but you're going to do it with a college diploma." And people might talk about New Hampshire education as not being at the top of the list 50 years ago. The fact is, it was good enough to get me out of there. Now, I think we'll say a black kid who'd been in my same circumstances, I don't think would have got the same education. If they were in a different area, which didn't even have the property taxes to support the kind of schooling I had, then they're not going to get that kind of chance. And I'd like to see a lot more discussion about how do we get an education system that gives every kid the chance to get out of whatever circumstances they're in. And I know with my own parents, and I think it's true for a lot of parents, they like to be able to look at it and say, okay, my life is tough. I wish it wasn't this difficult, but by golly, my kids, I'm going to make sure my kids have a chance. And I'd like to see more kids have that opportunity.
I agree with that. I'm not going to follow up with my comment because otherwise we're never going to get to any of the questions of our audience. So let me start. The first one is about risk taking, and Asim asked the question about, it's often the case that leaders may actually go for the safe bet, in particular when you have short-term objectives, because this is what's going to make them successful in the short run. And you, on the other hand, must have done some bold bets after you inherited Honeywell in 2002. And that involves a fair amount of risk-taking. So what's your philosophy on that?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting to hear a lot of the discussion that you hear at various levels about risk-taking and the feeling that if we take more risks, then the returns are going to be greater. And, I guess investment theory and so on would kind of link that and say with greater risk does come greater returns. But if you're running a company, getting back to the two seemingly conflicting things point, if you tell people, I want you to do more risk-taking, a lot of them will take more risks. And some of them you're going to look at and say, that was an incredibly stupid thing they did. Why? I know it's a risk, but it was a stupid risk. And in reality, again, the two seemingly conflicting things, when we say do more risk-taking, we're saying do intelligent risk-taking. It doesn't mean guarantees, but it means, okay, if this works, and I have a logical reason and basis to believe it's going to work, and I can track its progress so that in its early stages, if it's not going well, I can kill it when it's not paying off well, or it looks like it's not going to pay off, then this is worth doing. And yes, we did take a number of those. Some of them worked. There were airplane platforms we chased that we put a lot of money into and we did not get. And, obviously I'd wish we had. There were others like the invention of hydrofluoroolefins, the HFOs, that are non-ozone depleting and have less GWP than carbon dioxide, so you can use them for refrigerants. Well, that was a big bet because we were betting that we could invent a new molecule that would work. And over the course of 5 years that it took to develop it, it wasn't clear that it was going to work, but it looked like a bet worth making. And the one thing I did do with all R&D is I put none of it on the balance sheet. All of it got expensed because I wanted people, it's funny how business leaders treat expense dollars different than balance sheet dollars. Even though a dollar is a dollar, they treat them differently. And if you put it in expense, then they just look at it a lot more like its own money. So I'm all in favor of risk taking, but always recognize that the word intelligent goes with it. It doesn't mean conservative. It means intelligent, so that you make a smart decision up front, and then you have the inch stones along the way to say, is this a risk that I should continue taking, or should I kill this thing before it's gotten out of hand?
Good. There is a question about board members and staff members that you couldn't trust, that you alluded on your day one. How did you deal with that? You transition them over time, or what was that? How did that work?
When it comes to board members, there's not a lot you can do but wait for them to retire. And that did happen over time. And I can remember in particular when the depth of the accounting issues struck me. I had a discussion at the board about it and said, look, just so you know, this is what I'm dealing with. And after the meeting, one of the, let's say, more senior directors pulled me aside and said, Dave, just so you know, none of us at the board want to hear about that again. As far as we're concerned, that if that's a problem, that's something you deal with. It's yours to manage. We don't want to hear about it. Okay. That gives you a sense for it. But what it did cause me to do is, because I couldn't trust my board and I couldn't trust my staff, I became a better leader because I started running my meetings differently. And when you think about how do you run a meeting, you start and you're beginning in a career, you start as an individual contributor. And what's your job? To analyze something, figure out what makes sense, advocate for it. Well, the higher up you go in an organization, the less you actually know about a particular problem or situation, just because there's too much to know and too many people involved. So if you keep acting that way, and most of us do, we have an idea, we tend to advocate, try to convince people, well, you can end up making some bad decisions. Well, because I couldn't trust anybody, and I felt like, boy, as soon as I say something, a third of people are against it because they didn't get my job. A third of people are for it because I said it and I'm the leader. And a third of people, they don't care. They just want a decision and they'll go do it. So I started running meetings differently and saying, okay, here's an issue. I don't know what to do about it. Even though I might have an idea, I don't know what to do about it. And I want to have a conversation. And I'd make sure everybody participated. And that if whether they were an introvert or an extrovert, I would call on them, make sure they got a chance to participate and tell me what they thought. And it's tough because you got to encourage points of view that you don't agree with to find out, do I really understand this? And you also have to be careful when somebody says something you do agree with, not to say, oh, I think she's got it. I think that could be it. Keep it in the middle. Now, when I would get done and everybody had had their say, and I'd looked around for body language, facial expressions, make sure everybody got their say, then I would start with the most junior person in the room and say, okay, what do you think I ought to do? And in the beginning, it's really fun because the first thing they do is look at their boss who goes to answer for them. And I'd always put up my hand and say, no, I'll get to you. I promise. I want to know what you think. And they're kind of put on the spot and they have to talk. And I would do that around the table all the way to the most senior person. Only then, once I had all that, would I say, okay, here's my decision. And here's why. And I would make it very clear to the people with whom, say, I ended up disagreeing, that I had listened to their argument, that I understood their argument, but that I just disagreed with it. Because too many people think, if you don't agree with me, by definition, you're not listening. And I wanted it to be very clear. No, I did listen. I did hear you. But this is why I'm making the decision I am. Well, I found I was making much better decisions, and decisions that I was a lot more comfortable with. And I felt like I had a better sense that people were going to do it. So it actually ended up being a godsend. And it's one of the things that I talk about in the book is there's a different way to run meetings than most of us have learned how to do growing up in big companies.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I have maybe time for two more quick questions. One is digital transformation. So Honeywell became an increasingly digital firm under your leadership. And that by itself was a pivot that, in hindsight is obvious, but, you had to make a decision. You had to dedicate resources, move resources in that direction. What was your thinking around that time? Because that started also early on in your tenure.
Yeah, I actually started on that probably about my second or third year at Honeywell. And one of the things I used to do is I used to devote 2 to 3 days a year, full-time days, to doing what I called my blue book exercise. And my blue book was just a little empty blue notebook that I had. And I would force myself to sit by myself, sometimes in a hotel room, sometimes in the office, and just think about the company and just think about the operations, the people, the businesses, the countries, and just sit and think, which for somebody like me with my, slight ADD and my action orientation is not as simple as it may sound. It took some effort for me to do that. And I would sometimes gather some information to say, okay, something to prompt my thinking about stuff. So I'd ask for something on engineering and said, I want to know more about what kind of engineers we have. So this was like my, like I said, second or third year. And I expected to see the dispersion, mechanical, electrical, and chemical. And something like 20 or 25% of our engineers were developing software. And I thought, wow, okay, what's going on here? And I need to understand this better. So I spent a bunch of time understanding it and said, oh, okay, this is a big potential competitive advantage for us. And that interplay between physical and digital is going to become more and more important. So I just went on a tear with it, and especially building up capability in India, where despite everybody thinking that it was low cost, low quality, what I found was it was low cost, high quality. And as a continuation of the Deming concept, there's something called computer maturity model integrated, which is basically the Deming approach, but for software development. I was having a hell of a time getting any developed country Honeywell operation to think about CMMI level 5. And they all felt like 2 or 3 was good enough. My India operation was a level 5 already. And I said, okay, well, if I can't convince you guys, then I'm going to build up in the place where I know they're interested and know how to do it. And like anything else, you just start doing it and it just snowballs. So it went from, say, 20 to 25 to 30. And by the time I left, 50% of our engineers were developing software, because the more you learn, the more application you see. And my successor, Darius Adamczyk, who also has a computer science background in his BS and MS, is taking it a full other step in terms of really driving this as a software industrial. So I got to say, I'm really pleased with that whole effort, and I'm a big believer in it. It's going to be essential for any industrial company, by any company. You can't ignore it.
Good. Okay, we're already over time. There are tons of questions to be answered. Well, we'll have to end. David, this is wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Are you saying my answers were just too long? Is that the?
They were very insightful, and maybe
this is your way of getting one of the books.
Yeah. So I'm actually about to say something about that. So first of all, best of luck with the launch of the book, which is coming out on June 30th. We had actually said that every person that submits a question and their question was asked, they will get a copy of the book by the sender. I monopolized the exchange, and as a result, most people would not get the book. So now I'm saying that I'm responsible for that. So we will get the book, and we'll send to every person that asked the question, even though I didn't manage to ask it, because it was very interesting and engaging, and I have to say that I picked up some things that I'm gonna start using myself. So,
that's very rewarding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for chiming in. Thank you, David, for your time. Good night to everyone.
Good night to everyone. Thank you.